Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of The Q and the Gray, which is episode 11 of season 3 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Slacker101. So, The Q and the Gray is the episode in which Q shows up to Voyager proposing that he and Janeway have a child, and Janeway, of course, refuses, and when she does, Q takes her to the Q continuum and reveals that there's been a civil war going amongst the Q continuum. Eventually, Q's female friend, who is trapped on Voyager, finds their way to the Q continuum, and they use Q weapons in order to rescue Q and Janeway, and then come to an agreement between both sides of the Q civil war, where Q has a child with the female Q in order to create new blood in the Q continuum, and thus satisfying the conflict. So this episode is typically known as being quite a bad one. In fact, I think that's why Slacker101 suggested this, to have me sort of rip into it, because it's sort of known as a bad one. In fact, it is sort of an occurrence where pretty much every episode that Q appears in that is outside of Star Trek The Next Generation, he had one appearance on Deep Space Nine and 3 appearances on Voyager, and out of those 4 episodes, only one of them, the episode Death Wish, was good. The other 3 are known as quite bad, so it seems like Death Wish was sort of an exception, that whenever Q appears outside of Next Generation, it's not good. And this was the follow-up to Death Wish, so obviously, Q didn't appear again in Deep Space Nine because his first appearance was a failure, but because his first appearance on Voyager was a success, they decided, well, let's have him again, but each subsequent appearance was sucked. And now, I actually blame, I don't know if I'd blame Q. I'd actually more blame the seasons that they came in, because Q's second appearances and third appearances came in season 3 and season 7, which were I believe, the worst seasons of Voyager. So I think the bad writing is more of a sign of how the overall season was bad. And I was just looking at season 3's sort of episode list, and it seems like just bad episode after bad episode, but I'll cover this eventually when I get to my overall review of season 3. But just looking at it, I think this episode is just it's just a sign of, it's just a symptom of the overall horrible season. But it is definitely one of the highlights of the season not being good. And they tried to follow up with Death Wish, which, as I said, was a fan favorite. It's not one of my personal favorite episodes, as it is some people, but I did quite enjoy it. And so they have a follow-up storyline because they hinted that the Q Continuum could be in turmoil after the decision that Quinn made to end his life. So this was sort of a follow-up to that, where you see that it's actually a civil war. However, just the way it was accomplished was so juvenile, so childish, it just does not work at all. First of all, this episode starts off with a long segment about this Q trying to sort of get it on with Janeway, I suppose you could say. He's basically just sexually harassing her for the first 20 minutes or so of the episode, and it's very cringeworthy to watch. Now, Q has always had a mischievous demeanor, and is always known as someone who's very sort of smug and annoying and difficult to be around, and just likes to fuck with people. But here, I think they take it to an uncomfortable area where he's actually just sexually harassing Janeway and talking about getting it on. And even you set that aside and just look at his sort of behavior as it is, it just seems, it's not funny. It's just annoying, and it doesn't come off as very good. And not to mention that the whole concept that Q would spend so much time saying, trying to give her gifts. So here's a puppy, and talking to Paris and Kim and saying, how best do I hit it on with her? When really he should have just went right out and said, hey, there's a civil war going on in the Q continuum. So let's have this baby. But he keeps beating around the bush for no other purpose than plot, as far as I can see, because eventually when he does tell her, that's when the serious conversation starts. I suppose, the writers are probably like, oh, let's have all these wacky scenes with Q being funny, but it just comes off as horrible, cringeworthy, and is not at all worthy of the typical writing that is associated with Q. And there's another thing about this episode which actually bothers me about even good Q episodes like Deja Q. And I think Deja Q, the third season episode where Q of Next Generation, where Q was turned into a human, I think was the worst example of this, but it reappears in this episode as well. And I'm talking about how all the crew act like Q is lying. Like when Q shows up and said, "This is why I'm here," the crew would always be like, "Oh, I know you, Q. You're not going to fool me." But Q has actually never been disingenuous about why he's here. I mean, sure, he's lied here and there, but he's never, showed up with the Enterprise or in any ship, whatever, and said, "This is why I'm here," and it not being true. I mean, sometimes he hides his true reasons for being there, such as in Deep Space Nine episode, when really he knew that the station was in imminent danger and he didn't tell anyone, but he never, he never miscommunicated. He never presented something as if it wasn't true. He never misrepresented his case, which is what they act like in Deja Q, when he showed up and said he was human. It's like, "Oh, I don't believe you, Q. You lie all the time." But he wasn't lying. He never actually lies like that. And it's the same thing here when he's like, "I want to make it with Janeway." They're like, "Oh, find the real reason for him being here. He's just lying." Well, he wasn't lying. I mean, it's true that there was more to it than what he was saying, but they should learn to take Q at face value. And it really annoys me how they continually don't when there's actually no precedent for them to be behaving that way, especially in this episode when they actually had Voyager has had very rare interactions with Q, and they even have this line where Tom Paris is like, "Oh, I read about you on the Enterprise." Like, well, that's bullshit. If you read about him on the Enterprise, you know he doesn't lie. Anyway, so this episode introduced us to another Q character, which is always fun. This time we get a female Q, who's just, of course, referred to as Q. I think that gets a bit annoying how every other Q is referred to as Q. If they're omniscient beings, you'd think they'd have a way to differentiate one from another. I guess Quinn was the exception in Death Wish because he was a rebellious Q. But anyway, she's played by the same actress who played Kalar in Next Generation, who's a good actress, and I think she makes this role bearable because the writing itself is unbearable, and they have this good actress in who sort of puts it in, but it's so horrible. It's so painfully obvious what they were doing as soon as they introduced her, that she's the real person that Q needs to be with, and they're the ones who have the real romance. And she was acting all jealous of Janeway, which is being obtuse. If she was omniscient being, she would actually know that Janeway had zero interest in Q, and Q was just annoying her. And so that whole thing that they tried to do a romantic comedy type thing, it was so dumb, it was so stupid. I did not buy it for a single second. And then there's one scene in particular that really gets me, that was just one of the most worst, horrible scenes in Voyager, I believe, is when Q gives Janeway a puppy, and then the female Q shows up and she says, "Oh, get away from that dog." And then they look at the puppy, and she's like, "I'm not talking about the puppy." And then Q and Janeway have this shocked look on their faces, which is so fake. It was so fake. It was so obvious that the director was like, "Okay, guys, look shocked." And it was so fake. It didn't feel real, like they would actually look be shocked in that way that they looked. They could tell it was telegraphed. And I don't necessarily blame the actors. It's because the writing was so bad that they wouldn't really be shocked, and the directors were probably asking something unrealistic of them. Look shocked, when really that's not how they would react in this situation. It was just, as I said, I think this bad writing in this episode is just a symptom of the overall bad writing in season 3. But anyway, We also get the Q Continuum War, which is an interesting concept, but it was executed so poorly. Now, in this episode, we see them in like a Civil War type setting, like American Civil War, because, it's a Q Civil War. American Civil War, get it? Ha ha ha. Anyway, we see them like in the, this old, 18th or 19th century setting, and I guess it's supposed to be the American South. And they're dressed as the Union and Confederate, and of course, the Q purists, who are seen as the bad guys, are presented as the Confederacy, because the Confederacy are bad and these Q are bad. But really, if they were going to take this analogy correctly, the Q that we know, I know it gets confusing, but John Delancey's Q and his side are the ones rebelling. So they should be the Confederacy, because they're the ones who are rebelling from the status quo, and the other Q are the status quo, so they should represent the Union. But, Confederacy bad, Union good. Let's look at it in black and white terms. And also, in addition to that, this whole thing has come under like fire, probably been scrutinized the most, of how the Voyager crew show up with muskets and hold the other Q at bay. Now, they tried to excuse this in the episode, like the absurdity like of holding an omniscient being hostage with a musket. They try to excuse this by saying, this is just a representation of the Q Continuum in order for the, us primitive primates, in order to comprehend it. That's not really the Civil War, and that's not really a musket they're holding. It's a Q weapon. They say this several times, like, this is a Q weapon that they're holding. But still, it's still hard to buy. It's really hard to buy that it could simplify it in that matters. And even if they had a Q weapon, these Q who are like infinitely superior, they can just snap their fingers and make a star explode, that they could be held at bay by a human, even if they were holding a Q weapon. It's just really hard to grasp. And the whole concept of this just being a representation is to just take it to an unrealistic and horrible extreme in this episode. Like, we first get the hint of this in the episode Death Wish, where they go to the Q Continuum. It's just they're sitting by a roadside, and it's just people sitting around looking bored, and that was supposed to be a representation of the Q Continuum. Okay, so that worked for that episode. I think even that was a little bit of a stretch, but not too bad. I think it worked for the episode, because they were saying, Q made it clear this was just a representation of the Q Continuum. But here, they took that analogy and that same device and took it to an unrealistic and ridiculous extreme that simply does not work, and do not buy for a single second. So one little other nitpick I want to mention about this episode is the episode starts off with them witnessing a supernova, and Janeway says that they're only the third Starfleet ship to ever witness a supernova up this close. And we see two other occurrences I can think of in Star Trek episodes. In Star Trek the original series, Kirk and his Enterprise was by a supernova in the episode All Our Yesterdays, because they traveled back in time, whatever, right before the nova went off, and the Enterprise was still there when the nova went off. And then Next Generation, there was the episode Tin Man with the living ship thingy, and he went to a supernova to die, and so they were by a supernova in that case. And then also, but there's also Generations. There was I believe Sworn was setting off supernovas, I believe, if I remember correctly. And I'm sure there's probably other examples in Star Trek alone. So they still say they're the second ship, so I guess the other two ships are Kirk's Enterprise and Picard's Enterprise. But that's ridiculous. That is hard for me to buy, that they're the only ships in Starfleet who witness supernovas. I mean, I know this episode was just trying to say the supernova is a rare occurrence, and fair enough, whatever, but I think they just took it to an unrealistic extreme. I'm like, what do all these other Starfleet ships out there do that we're not saying? It seems like they don't do anything. They just do nothing. They suck. The only things happen to Enterprises, apparently, but whatever. Anyway, so my rating for the Q and a Gray out of 10 is a 3, very poor. This isn't the worst episode in the world. I mean, it was somewhat enjoyable. Like I said, the performances in this episode were good for what they were trying to do with the horrible written script that they were given. And we did get some interesting moments, some funny moments with Q, and some interesting moments with the crew trying to survive all these supernovas that made this episode watchable. But as I said, there was too much about this episode that was annoying, that just didn't work. It was very horribly written, did not come across well. So yeah, not a good episode. So that's it for my review of the Q and the Gray. If there's an episode of any of the 5 Star Trek series that you would like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review, but please only 1 episode request per person. And also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other Star Trek videos that I do, and also other shows like Game of Thrones, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.